Lieutenant Commander David Sterling stood in the corner of the grand ballroom like a man trying to become one with the wallpaper, which would have been impressive if the wallpaper hadn't been a living, shifting tapestry that apparently found his presence as awkward as he did. The Ethesian Imperial Palace's main ballroom was a study in controlled chaos, with crystalline walls that pulsed in colors David was fairly certain didn't exist in human visual spectrums, and floating chandeliers that defied both gravity and good taste by singing in harmonies that made his fillings ache. "Remember, Sterling," Ambassador Chen had told him before they'd entered this diplomatic fever dream, "you're here to observe, learn, and try not to accidentally start an interstellar incident. Think of yourself as very expensive furniture." David was taking that advice to heart, which was why he'd positioned himself near what appeared to be a refreshment station, though he wasn't entirely sure if the floating spheres of luminescent liquid were drinks, decorations, or some kind of alien life form that happened to look delicious. "Magnificent turnout," rumbled Ambassador Vorthak of the Centaurian Trade Consortium, his three heads nodding in what David had learned was the universal gesture for "I'm pretending to be impressed" while calculating profit margins. "Indeed," agreed his companion, a crystalline being whose name David couldn't pronounce without risking vocal cord damage. "Though I note the absence of the Andromedan delegation. Political statement, perhaps." David nodded along politely, sipping what he hoped was champagne, and trying not to think about the fact that he was the only human in a room containing representatives from 47 different species, most of whom still thought Earth was a quaint little backwater that had somehow stumbled into galactic politics by accident. Which, to be fair, wasn't entirely inaccurate. The ballroom stretched out before him like a living jewel box, filled with beings that seemed to have been designed by artists with access to physics that normal matter shouldn't be able to support. Delegates from the silicon-based hegemony glittered like living diamonds as they conversed with representatives of the plasma collectives, whose forms seemed to shift between states of matter as casually as David might change his expression. "You know what I love about diplomatic functions," David muttered to himself, a habit he developed during long, boring assignments. "The way everyone pretends they're not constantly calculating who to ally with and who to quietly assassinate." A nearby delegate who looked like a cross between an octopus and a formal dinner jacket turned one of its many eyes toward him, and David smiled politely while making a mental note to keep his observations to himself. That was when she entered the ballroom, and David suddenly understood why poets throughout the galaxy wrote verses about things being indescribable, because his entire vocabulary seemed to have evacuated his brain through his ears. Princess Lyrelei of the Ethesian Empire didn't walk into the room so much as she flowed into it, like liquid starlight given form and purpose. Her skin held depths that reminded David of looking into clear water at night, where you could see stars reflected but couldn't tell where the water ended and the sky began. Her elongated ears, the hallmark of her species, were adorned with what appeared to be living jewelry that shifted through colors David was fairly certain his eyes weren't equipped to process properly. She moved through the crowd with the kind of grace that made David wonder if gravity worked differently for royalty, pausing to greet various dignitaries with the perfect balance of warmth and formal dignity that he'd only read about in diplomatic training manuals. "Now that," said Ambassador Vorthak approvingly, "is how you make an entrance." "The princess has always had exceptional presence," agreed the crystalline delegate, "though I hear she's become rather selective about her social engagements lately. Political pressures, you understand." David watched, transfixed, as Princess Lyrelei engaged in conversation with what appeared to be a group of ambassadors from the Spiral Confederation. Even from across the vast ballroom, he could see the way her eyes lit up with genuine interest as she listened, the way her laughter created visible ripples in the air around her, and the way every being in her vicinity seemed to stand a little straighter in her presence. She was, David realized, absolutely magnificent in a way that had nothing to do with politics or diplomacy, or the complex web of interstellar relations that had brought them all together. She was magnificent in the way that supernovas were magnificent, or the way Earth's aurora looked from orbit, or the way music sounded when you heard it performed perfectly for the first time. "She's the most magnificent princess I've ever seen," David whispered, not really intending to speak aloud but unable to keep the observation entirely to himself. The words seemed to hang in the air around him, competing with the ballroom's ambient harmonics and the general susurrus of diplomatic conversation. David immediately felt his face flush with embarrassment at having voiced such an unprofessional thought, even quietly, and he took a larger sip of his maybe champagne, while trying to convince himself that no one had heard him over the general noise of the gathering. Which was when Princess Lyrelei, who had been facing away from him across the entire length of the ballroom, began to turn her head in his direction. The movement was slow, deliberate, and somehow caused the entire ballroom to seem quieter, as if the universe itself was holding its breath to see what would happen next. David felt his heart stop somewhere in the region of his throat, as those luminous silver eyes began scanning the crowd, moving inexorably toward his corner of the room. "Oh," he said very quietly, finally understanding that Ethesian hearing was apparently far more acute than human diplomatic briefings had suggested. "Oh no." Ambassador Vorthak's middle head swiveled toward him with interest. "Something wrong, young human?" David watched in fascination and growing terror as Princess Lyrelei's gaze continued its methodical sweep of the ballroom, moving past clusters of dignitaries and conversation groups with the focused intensity of someone who had heard something interesting and intended to locate its source. "I think," David said carefully, "I may have just committed my first diplomatic incident." The crystalline delegate made a sound like wind chimes in a gentle breeze, which David had learned was their species' equivalent of polite laughter. "What sort of incident could you possibly commit from over here? You haven't moved from this spot in over an hour." David opened his mouth to explain, then closed it again as Princess Lyrelei's eyes found his across the crowded ballroom. The connection was immediate, electric, and absolutely impossible to ignore. Her expression shifted from searching to curious to something that might have been amusement, and David felt the distinct sensation of being examined by an intelligence that was both ancient and surprisingly playful. "The sort of incident," he said weakly, as the princess began moving through the crowd toward him, "that involves accidentally complimenting alien royalty loudly enough for them to hear across a ballroom designed for beings with superhuman senses." Ambassador Vorthak's three heads turned in unison to follow David's gaze, taking in the sight of the Ethesian princess making her way directly toward their little group with the kind of purposeful movement that suggested this was not a casual social encounter. "Ah," Vorthak said, his voice carrying the tone of someone who had just realized they were about to witness either a diplomatic triumph or a spectacular disaster. "Yes, I can see how that might be problematic." David straightened his dress uniform, checked to make sure he hadn't spilled anything on himself, and prepared to discover which category his evening was about to fall into. Princess Lyrelei moved through the ballroom like water finding its way downhill, inevitable, graceful, and somehow making everything else in the room seem to adjust its position to accommodate her passage. David watched her approach with the kind of fascination usually reserved for natural disasters or particularly spectacular spacecraft explosions, events that were simultaneously beautiful and potentially catastrophic for anyone caught too close. "Sterling," Ambassador Chen's voice crackled through his subvocal communicator, "what exactly did you do? The princess appears to be heading directly toward our position, and I'm getting some very interesting looks from the Ethesian diplomatic corps." David touched his throat to activate the return channel, never taking his eyes off the approaching princess. "I may have made a small tactical error in sound projection, sir." Define small tactical error. I called her magnificent. Out loud. Apparently loud enough for enhanced alien hearing to pick up across a ballroom the size of a small space station. There was a pause that lasted just long enough for David to wonder if Ambassador Chen had suffered some kind of diplomatic stroke. Sterling, Chen's voice returned, carefully controlled. Please tell me you're joking. I wish I were, sir. She's approximately 30 seconds away from reaching my position, and she appears to be smiling. Indeed, Princess Lyralay's expression had settled into something that was definitely amusement, tinged with what David desperately hoped was curiosity rather than the kind of royal displeasure that historically ended with people being fed to interesting alien wildlife. As she drew closer, David began to appreciate just how thoroughly he was outclassed by the situation. The princess's presence seemed to create its own microclimate of increased gravity and enhanced awareness, as if reality itself was paying closer attention to whatever space she happened to occupy. The living jewels adorning her ears pulsed in complex patterns that David suspected conveyed information he wasn't equipped to interpret, and her silver eyes held depths that reminded him of looking into deep space from the observation deck of a starship. Breathe, Sterling, he reminded himself quietly. She's just a person who happens to be alien royalty with the power to have you ejected from the ballroom, the palace, the planet, and possibly the star system, but still technically a person. Ambassador Vorthak leaned closer, his central head tilting toward David conspiratorially. Young human, I've attended diplomatic functions throughout the galaxy for over 2 centuries, and I've never seen Princess Lyralay make such a direct approach toward anyone below the rank of sector governor. Whatever you said, it was either remarkably impressive or remarkably offensive. Given my track record with diplomatic statements, David replied, I'm leaning toward offensive. The crystalline delegate chimed softly. Actually, observing her body language and the patterns of her ear jewels, I would suggest she appears more intrigued than insulted. Ethesian emotional displays are quite distinctive once you learn to read them. Princess Lyralay was now close enough that David could see the way the ballroom's shifting lights reflected in her skin, creating patterns that seemed to move independently of the ambient illumination. She paused briefly to acknowledge a cluster of senior ambassadors, with the kind of gracious nod that managed to be both perfectly polite and clearly dismissive, before continuing her approach to David's corner of the ballroom. Last chance to run, David muttered to himself. I wouldn't recommend it, Vorthak advised. Ethesians consider running from royalty to be either an insult or an invitation to hunt, depending on the circumstances. That's not helpful. It wasn't meant to be helpful, it was meant to be accurate. Princess Lyralay came to a stop directly in front of David, close enough that he could see the way her eyes held flecks of what looked like actual starlight, and the way her presence seemed to make the air itself more interesting. The conversation around them didn't exactly stop, but it definitely quieted to the level where everyone nearby could pretend they weren't eavesdropping while actually hanging on every word. So, she said, her voice carrying harmonics that made David think of wind chimes made from crystallized music, you're the one who thinks I'm magnificent. It wasn't a question, exactly, though it carried the inflection of someone who was curious about the answer. David felt his diplomatic training engage in a brief, futile struggle with his natural tendency toward honesty, and honesty won by a significant margin. Yes, Your Highness, he said, managing to keep his voice steady despite the fact that his cardiovascular system seemed to have forgotten how to function properly. I did say that, and I meant it. The princess's expression shifted slightly, and David realized that his response had surprised her. You meant it, she repeated, as if she were examining the concept from multiple angles. I did. I mean, I do. You're the most beautiful being I've encountered in my travels, and I've been to 17 different star systems. That includes the crystal gardens of Altair Prime and the aurora fields of Vega 7, both of which are considered natural wonders of the galaxy. The princess tilted her head slightly, causing the living jewels in her ears to shift through new color patterns. You compare me to natural phenomena. David felt heat rising in his cheeks. I didn't mean to be presumptuous, Your Highness. It's just that beauty on that scale. It seemed like the only appropriate comparison. Interesting. She moved slightly closer, and David caught a hint of her scent, something like ozone and starlight with undertones he couldn't identify. Most beings who wish to compliment me use comparisons to precious gems or rare metals, things that can be possessed or traded. Well, David said, his natural honesty overriding what remained of his diplomatic caution, natural phenomena can't be possessed. They can only be experienced and appreciated. That seems more respectful, I suppose. The silence that followed his statement seemed to expand outward from their conversation like ripples in still water. David became acutely aware that Princess Lyrelei was studying him, with an intensity that made him feel like he was being analyzed at the molecular level, while simultaneously being conscious that approximately half the ballroom was pretending not to watch their interaction. You know, the princess said finally, her voice carrying a note of what sounded like genuine pleasure, I don't believe anyone has ever called me magnificent before. At least, not in a way that suggested they actually meant the word, rather than simply using it as diplomatic currency. Your Highness, David said carefully, with respect, I find that very hard to believe. Surely, you must receive compliments regularly. Her laugh was like silver bells with undertones of distant thunder. Oh, I receive compliments constantly, Lieutenant Commander Sterling. But there's a significant difference between someone telling me I'm beautiful because they want something from me, and someone simply appreciating beauty when they see it. David blinked. You know my name. I know the names of all the diplomatic personnel attending tonight's function. It's part of basic royal preparation. She paused, her eyes twinkling with what was definitely amusement. Though I'll admit, your particular diplomatic credentials made for interesting reading. Tendency toward unconventional problem-solving approaches was my favorite line. That's a diplomatic way of saying I have a talent for making situations more complicated than they need to be, David said ruefully. Is that what you've done here? Princess Lyrelei asked, and David realized that despite the formal setting and the watching crowd, she seemed genuinely curious about his answer. David looked around the ballroom, taking in the barely concealed attention of various alien dignitaries, Ambassador Chen's barely visible panic from across the room, and the princess's own apparent enjoyment of their conversation. Your Highness, he said honestly, I have absolutely no idea, but I suspect I'm about to find out. What followed was perhaps the most surreal 20 minutes of David's diplomatic career, during which he found himself in increasingly genuine conversation with alien royalty, while a growing audience of galactic dignitaries pretended to discuss trade agreements, but were obviously eavesdropping on every word. You mentioned 17 star systems, Princess Lyrelei said, accepting what appeared to be a floating sphere of luminescent liquid from a passing server. That's considerably more travel than most humans your age would have experienced. The occupational hazard of diplomatic service, David replied, taking what he hoped was a complimentary beverage. Though I have to admit, most of those assignments were to places where the primary qualification was willing to go somewhere other diplomats consider too dangerous or too boring. And which category did tonight fall into? David considered this seriously. Well, I thought it was going to be boring. The danger part appears to be developing spontaneously. The princess's laughter created visible ripples in the air around them, and David noticed that several nearby delegates had given up any pretense of their own conversations. Your Highness, I have an unusual way of viewing most things. It comes from spending too much time in situations where normal perspectives don't apply. David gestured around the ballroom. I mean, 3 hours ago I was worried about remembering which fork to use for which course. Now I'm having a conversation with the most powerful princess in the known galaxy about the relative dangers of diplomatic boredom. The most powerful princess, she repeated thoughtfully. Is that how you see me? David realized he'd walked into potentially sensitive territory, but his honesty streak was apparently unstoppable at this point. Your Highness, I see you as someone who could probably end my career with a casual comment to the right person, reshape interstellar trade with a policy decision, or start a war if someone sufficiently irritated you. But mostly, I see you as someone who seems genuinely interested in having a real conversation, instead of the usual diplomatic theater. Princess Lyrale's expression grew thoughtful, and the living jewels in her ears shifted to deeper, more complex patterns. You're right about the power, Lieutenant Commander. What's interesting is that you acknowledge it without either trying to use it or being paralyzed by it. Well, David said, I figure you hear about your own power constantly. It seemed like it might be more interesting to talk about something else. Such as? David looked around the ballroom, taking in the incredible diversity of beings, the impossible architecture, and the casual display of technologies that still seemed like magic to him. Such as how you experience all of this. I mean, for me, tonight is overwhelming in the best possible way. Everything here is new and strange and beautiful, but you've grown up with this. Does it still feel magical, or has familiarity made it ordinary? The princess was quiet for so long that David began to wonder if he'd somehow crossed a cultural line he didn't know existed. When she finally spoke, her voice carried a note of something that might have been surprise. No one has ever asked me that question before. Really? Really? Most conversations I have are about policy implications, trade agreements, cultural exchanges, or marriage proposals. She paused, her eyes focusing on something beyond the ballroom. I can't remember the last time someone asked me how I felt about my own life. David felt a sudden surge of sympathy. That sounds lonely. It is, she said simply, then seemed to realize what she'd admitted. I shouldn't have said that. It's not diplomatic. Your Highness, with respect, we passed beyond normal diplomatic conversation about 10 minutes ago. I think we're in the territory where it's okay to be honest about things. Princess Lyrale looked at him with an expression that seemed to be reassessing everything about their interaction. You're not what I expected from a human diplomat. What were you expecting? Someone more calculating, I suppose, more focused on advancement or advantage. Most beings who speak to me are trying to gain something, even if it's just social status from being seen in conversation with royalty. David considered this. Well, I'm definitely gaining something from this conversation, Your Highness. Her expression sharpened slightly, such as, I'm learning that being magnificent doesn't necessarily make someone happy, David said honestly. And I'm discovering that even the most powerful person in the room can be lonely in ways that power can't fix. The silence that followed his words seemed to create a bubble of privacy around them, despite the fact that they were surrounded by hundreds of other beings. Princess Lyrale studied his face with an intensity that made David feel like she was reading his mind, though he'd been briefed that ethicians weren't telepathic. You meant that, she said finally. The loneliness part. You actually see it. Your Highness, I've spent enough time being the only human in rooms full of aliens to recognize isolation when I see it. The circumstances are different, but the feeling isn't. And yet you chose this career path. I chose it because someone needs to build bridges between species, and I seem to be good at talking to beings who are different from me. David paused, then added, though I usually manage to do it without accidentally shouting compliments across ballrooms. Princess Lyrale's laugh was warmer this time, more personal. I'm rather glad you made that particular mistake, Lieutenant Commander Sterling. David, he said impulsively. I mean, if we're having an honest conversation, you might as well call me David. The princess's eyes widened slightly. That's remarkably informal for a diplomatic function. Yes, it is. but I get the impression you don't get many opportunities for informal conversation. I don't. She was quiet for a moment, then said, "You may call me Lyreley. When we're speaking personally, I mean." David felt something shift in the atmosphere around them, a sense that they'd crossed some kind of invisible boundary. "Thank you, Lyreley. That means more than you might realize." "Actually," she said, her voice carrying a note of something that might have been wonder, "I think I'm beginning to understand exactly what it means." Around them, the ballroom continued its elegant dance of interstellar diplomacy. But David realized that he and Princess Lyreley had somehow created their own small universe of genuine connection in the middle of all the political theater. "Lyreley," he said carefully, "can I ask you something?" "Of course. When you heard me say you were magnificent, how did that make you feel?" She considered the question with the same seriousness she might have given to a treaty negotiation. "Like someone had seen me," she said finally. "Really seen me, not just my position or my political value or my potential usefulness. Like I was worth appreciating for my own sake." "You are," David said simply. "Worth appreciating, I mean. Both for your own sake and for the way you're handling this conversation. Most royalty would have had me arrested by now for excessive informality." "Most royalty," Princess Lyreley said with a smile that seemed to make the ballroom's lights brighter, "don't get the opportunity to have conversations this interesting." David raised his glass in what he hoped was an appropriately respectful toast. "To interesting conversations, then." "To magnificent moments," she replied, raising her own glass to meet his. As their glasses touched with a musical chime that seemed to harmonize with the ballroom's ambient sounds, David realized that his simple, honest compliment had somehow opened a door to possibilities he'd never imagined. The evening had taken on a dreamlike quality that David was fairly certain would seem impossible when he tried to explain it later. Somehow, he and Princess Lyreley had migrated from the main ballroom to a quieter alcove overlooking the palace gardens, where floating luminescent plants created patterns that shifted with the rhythm of the planet's twin moons. "This is better," Lyreley said, settling onto what appeared to be a bench grown from living crystal. "The ballroom's acoustic design amplifies everything. Privacy is nearly impossible when every conversation becomes background music for everyone else." David took a seat beside her, careful to maintain what he hoped was appropriate distance while still being able to continue their conversation. "Is privacy something you value highly, or is it just that public conversations come with more political implications?" "Both," she said honestly. "When you're always representing your people, your government, your planet, sometimes you forget what it feels like to just exist as yourself." "And how does it feel, existing as yourself, I mean?" Lyreley looked out at the gardens, where bioluminescent flowers created constellations that rivaled the actual stars overhead. "Lighter," she said after a moment. "Like I can think thoughts that don't have to be approved by council advisors or filtered through diplomatic protocol. Such as wondering what it would be like to travel to 17 different star systems as David Sterling, rather than as Princess Lyreley with a full diplomatic entourage and security detail." She turned to look at him directly. "What's the most beautiful thing you've seen in your travels?" David considered the question seriously, running through memories of crystal caverns on Altair Prime, the aurora phenomena of Vega 7, and the living cities of the Centaurian worlds. "Actually," he said slowly, "I think it might be watching beings from completely different species find ways to communicate and understand each other. There's something hopeful about it. Like the universe is bigger and more connected than any of us realize individually." "That's not what I expected you to say." "What were you expecting?" "Something about landscapes or architecture or natural phenomena." "Most travelers talk about the spectacular sights they've witnessed." David shrugged. "Spectacular sights are impressive, but they don't really change how you see the universe. Watching a silicon-based life form and a plasma entity figure out how to share a joke, though, That changes your perspective on what's possible. Lyreley was quiet for several moments, and David began to worry that he'd said something wrong. When she finally spoke, her voice carried a note of something that might have been awe. "David," she said, "you realize that what you just described is essentially the philosophy behind the entire Ethesian diplomatic program, don't you?" "Is it?" "We call it the theory of convergent understanding. The idea that connection between different forms of consciousness is not only possible but inevitable, given enough patience and genuine curiosity." She paused, studying his face in the garden's shifting light. "You've independently arrived at one of our oldest philosophical principles. Great minds think alike," David suggested with a self-deprecating smile. "Or perhaps," Lyreley said thoughtfully, "there are certain truths about connection and understanding that transcend species boundaries." Their conversation was interrupted by the approach of a figure that David immediately recognized as trouble, even if he couldn't identify the specific nature of the threat. Emperor Thaldrin of the Ethesian Empire moved with the kind of presence that made gravity seem like a personal choice, and his expression suggested that finding his daughter in private conversation with a human diplomat was not part of his evening's preferred agenda. "Lyreley," the Emperor said, his voice carrying harmonics that made the garden's luminescent plants dim slightly in apparent respect, "I've been looking for you. The Andromedan delegation has arrived, and protocol requires your presence for the formal greetings." "Of course, Father," Lyreley said, rising gracefully from the crystal bench. "Allow me to introduce Lieutenant Commander David Sterling of the Earth Diplomatic Corps. David, this is my father, Emperor Thaldrin." David stood quickly, his diplomatic training finally reasserting itself as he executed what he hoped was an appropriate bow for meeting the ruler of a galactic empire. "Your Imperial Majesty, it's an honor to meet you." The Emperor's 6 eyes focused on David with the kind of attention usually reserved for potentially dangerous specimens. "Lieutenant Commander Sterling, yes, I've heard about you this evening. Nothing too damaging, I hope, Your Majesty." "On the contrary, my daughter's conversation partners are always of interest to me, particularly when they manage to hold her attention for such an extended period." Emperor Thaldrin's expression remained neutral, but David detected what might have been curiosity beneath the formal scrutiny. "Tell me, Lieutenant Commander, what is your assessment of tonight's diplomatic proceedings?" David realized he was being tested, though he wasn't entirely sure what the right answer might be. He decided to go with honesty, which had served him surprisingly well so far. "Your Majesty, I think tonight represents something more significant than the formal agenda suggests. The beings gathered here don't just represent their governments, they represent different ways of understanding the universe. The real success won't be measured in trade agreements signed, but in how many new forms of connection we establish." The Emperor's expression shifted slightly, and David caught a glance exchanged between him and Lyreley that seemed to communicate volumes. "An interesting perspective," Emperor Thaldrin said slowly, "and you believe such connections are valuable." "I believe they're essential, Your Majesty. The galaxy is vast and full of incredible diversity. We can either spend our energy fighting about our differences, or we can use our differences to create something better than any of us could achieve alone." "Father," Lyreley interjected gently, "David has been sharing some fascinating insights about interspecies communication and understanding. His experiences as a diplomatic officer have given him a unique perspective on cross-cultural connection." The Emperor studied David for another long moment, then surprised him by smiling. "Lieutenant Commander Sterling, would you be interested in escorting my daughter to the evening's closing ceremony? I believe your unique perspective might add value to the proceedings." David felt his heart skip several beats as he processed the implications of the Emperor's request. Being asked to escort the princess wasn't just a social honor, it was a public statement about his importance and, by extension, humanity's place in galactic society. Your Majesty, he said carefully, I would be deeply honored if Princess Lyreley agrees. Lyreley's smile was radiant. I would be delighted, David, shall we? As they walked back toward the ballroom together, David became aware of the ripple of attention their pairing created. Conversations paused, heads turned, and he could practically feel the recalculation of political equations happening around them. Lyreley, he said quietly, you realize this is going to change how people perceive both me and my entire species, don't you? Yes, she said simply. Is that a problem? David thought about it seriously. No, he said finally. I think it's an opportunity. For what? For proving that connection and understanding aren't just pretty philosophical concepts. They're practical tools for building a better galaxy. As they entered the ballroom together, Princess Lyreley placed her hand lightly on David's arm in the traditional escort position. The gesture was simple, formal, and absolutely revolutionary in its implications. David, she said softly, as they approached the ceremonial platform where the evening's final protocols would take place. Thank you. For what? For seeing me as magnificent, she said, her voice carrying harmonics of genuine warmth. But more than that, for helping me remember what it feels like to be seen as a person rather than just a political position. Thank you, David replied, for showing me that magnificent beings can also be genuine, curious, and surprisingly good at making a nervous human diplomat feel like he might actually have something valuable to contribute to galactic society. As they took their places for the ceremony, surrounded by the most powerful beings in known space, David realized that his simple, honest compliment had done more than win him the friendship of an alien princess. It had opened a door to possibilities he was only beginning to understand, possibilities that might reshape not just his own future, but the future of human-alien relations throughout the galaxy. One last question, Lyreley said as the ceremony began around them. Yes, when you said I was magnificent, did you really mean it? David looked at her, at the starlight in her eyes, the grace of her movement, the genuine curiosity in her expression, and the way she'd chosen to see their conversation as an opportunity for connection rather than a diplomatic complication. Lyreley, he said honestly, I meant every word. You're the most magnificent being I've ever encountered, and spending this evening talking with you has been the highlight of my diplomatic career. Her smile